My life no longer belongs to him.
There are actors who play Dracula like a crown. Heavy, confident, commanding. And then there's Caleb Landry Jones, who plays Dracula like a wound that never closed. Luc Besson's Dracula: A Love Tale arrives with a specific promise. This is not a monster movie that wants your adrenaline. It's a gothic romance that wants your empathy, even when you're not sure you should give it. Besson has openly described the film as a romantic approach to the myth, one shaped around love, faith, and the ache of reunion. That choice changes everything, because once Dracula becomes a lover first, the performance cannot hide behind fangs and shadows. The acting has to carry the contradiction. Ancient violence and childlike longing, seduction and grief, power and loneliness. And that's where Caleb Landry Jones becomes the most interesting part of this entire vision. Not because he plays Dracula as a villain, but because he does something riskier. He plays him as fragile and dangerous at the same time. He makes the Count feel like a man who has survived centuries, yet still reacts like someone newly broken. Why Besson chose him, and why that matters.
God sent you here to kill me.
God sent me here to save you.
To understand Jones's Dracula, you have to understand the unusual way this casting happened. This was not a safe selection built around familiarity. This was a director choosing an energy. In an on-set feature with Deadline, Luc Besson describes Caleb Landry Jones as a creative trust. He frames him as someone he wants to make films with, not simply someone he hires for a role. That matters because Dracula is not a character you cast casually. Dracula is a tone. He's the center of gravity. If the actor cannot hold the film's emotional atmosphere, everything collapses. Besson's collaboration with Jones did not begin with Dracula. It sharpened with Dogman, where Besson built a story around a character who is both wounded and unpredictable. In interviews around Dogman, both Besson and Jones talk about the intensity of the work, and it's in that context that the director confirms they would reunite next for Dracula.
Then I've lived on waiting for her return.
This is important for one reason. It suggests Besson did not choose Jones because he resembles a traditional Dracula. He chose him because he can live inside contradiction without smoothing it out for the audience. That's the defining quality of Jones as an actor. He rarely plays dominance as simple strength. He often plays it as something unstable, a mask that might crack, a performance of power with fear leaking through it. So when Besson decides to make Dracula a romance-driven story about longing and spiritual questions, he needs a Dracula who can look like a threat and still feel like a loss. This is where the performance becomes almost documentary in its emotional effect. Because Jones does not present Dracula as a myth, he presents him as an emotional condition. And you can see this in the way the film has been discussed in European coverage. Even critics who are harsh about the film's choices still call attention to the scale of the production and to the centrality of this Dracula figure within it. A performance like this cannot be separated from its environment. Besson has emphasized the craft of building the world through real sets and costume work, and that physical world gives Jones something tangible to move through. When a director builds a gothic romance with practical texture, the actor is not acting against green screen emptiness. He's acting against weight, fabric, stone, cold, shadows. And Jones responds to weight with physicality. The body language of a wounded predator. Most Draculas move like they own the air. Jones often moves like the air hurts. That's the first clue that he's not playing a standard villain. He's playing ancient grief inside a predator's body. Let's break down what that means in performance terms. First, posture. Jones frequently collapses inward. Shoulders soften. Chest caves slightly. It's a choice that signals emotional contraction, like a person protecting something inside themselves. In human psychology, that inward posture is associated with shame, mourning, and guardedness. It's the opposite of conquest. But then the performance flips. He can straighten in an instant. When he wants to intimidate, he does not expand like a bodybuilder. He sharpens, like a blade. He becomes still, and the stillness becomes violence. This is what makes the performance feel fragile and dangerous at the same time. Fragility is not weakness here. Fragility is volatility. a cracked surface that can cut. Second, pacing. Jones does not always stalk. Sometimes he drifts. That drifting quality is crucial because it suggests dissociation, the sense that Dracula is not fully present in the moment he inhabits, like he's living partially in memory, partially in longing, partially in the past. This aligns with the romantic framing Besson has described, where Dracula is motivated by devotion and spiritual ache rather than simple appetite. Third, hands and touch. Jones uses his hands cautiously. A traditional Dracula might grab, seize, claim. Jones often hovers. Fingers pause before contact. Touch feels like both hunger and hesitation. That hesitation reads as fear of what touch will awaken in him. That's a performance choice that communicates moral conflict without words. And because this is a romance-forward Dracula, moral conflict is the entire point. If the Count is only evil, the romance becomes hollow. If he is only tender, the danger disappears. Jones keeps both alive at once. There is also a practical, factual context here. Interviews and set coverage frequently mention the scale of costume work and the many looks required across centuries, which implies a performance that must shift physically across eras. While some of the commentary about exact costume counts comes from lighter outlets, the broader point remains consistent across coverage. This Dracula is built with transformations and visual chapters, meaning Jones has to move like the same soul in different bodies. That requires physical storytelling. He cannot rely on dialogue to explain what version of Dracula he is in a given moment. He must communicate it through carriage, tempo, and tension. And that leads to the most powerful layer of his performance: micro-expressions. Micro-expressions and the face of ancient grief. If you want to understand why audiences call Jones unsettling, you have to look at what he does with stillness. Many actors signal emotion by enlarging it. Wider eyes, bigger reactions, clearer tells. Jones often does the opposite. He compresses emotion until it becomes unreadable. Then he lets one tiny crack show. A slight tightening in the jaw, a blink that arrives late, a stare that holds 1 second too long. Micro-expressions work because they resemble real human leakage. The facial movements people make when they're trying not to show what they feel. That's precisely what this Dracula must be. A creature that hides need behind power. A man who cannot admit how desperate he is without losing control. So Jones gives us a Dracula who looks like he's constantly managing himself. And then, in key moments, the management fails. You see grief on his face like a glitch. It passes quickly, it almost disappears, but it leaves residue. The audience feels it even if they cannot name it. This is where the performance becomes psychologically sophisticated, because grief that lasts centuries would not present like fresh grief. It would become warped, it would become ritual, it would become obsession disguised as romance, and it would leak out sideways through expressions that are not quite human anymore. Jones often gives Dracula a look that reads like longing, but there's a second emotion underneath it: control. Not control of others, control of himself. This is how he stays dangerous. Even when he looks fragile, you sense he's holding a predator back. That tension makes viewers uneasy. It tells them that tenderness might turn violent without warning. It's also worth noting how Besson frames the character in public commentary. In German press coverage, he describes Dracula as an ambivalent figure, cruel, yet driven by an elevated motive connected to love and reunion. That ambivalence needs an actor who can let two truths coexist on his face at once. Jones does that through facial contradictions. A softening around the eyes paired with a hard mouth. A vulnerable stare paired with stillness that feels like a threat. He also uses a kind of childlike openness at times, which is deeply unsettling in a predator character. It suggests emotional arrest, like Dracula stopped developing normally the moment loss happened, and he's been repeating that moment ever since. That's not a plot point, it's a performance reading. A psychological hypothesis based on what the actor is showing. Now we need to talk about the element that audiences keep bringing up over and over: the voice. The voice as character history. Voice is where Dracula lives. Dracula is one of the most voice-dependent characters in cinema history. The accent, the rhythm, the tempo, the breath, it's all part of the spell. Jones's voice choices have been widely noticed in promotional clips and interviews circulating around the film.
Contoured, if this is the right word, to fit better and things like this.
Some pieces explicitly note his commitment to staying in voice even while being interviewed in costume on set. Even when you treat that kind of anecdote cautiously, the consistent theme across coverage is this. Jones is not approaching the voice as a surface accent. He treats it like the character's nervous system. Here is what he seems to do with it. He slows it down, not in a theatrical way, in a weary way. He lets silence hang between words as if language itself is heavy. That implies time, centuries, the sense that Dracula has spoken many versions of these same emotions and is tired of hearing himself say them. He also uses an odd musicality. Certain phrases feel almost sung. That aligns with the film aesthetic ecosystem, which leans into operatic romance, and in broader coverage, Danny Elfman's score has been described as gothic, sensual, and built around lyrical motifs like waltzes and music box-like ideas. Even if Jones is not literally singing, he's matching the world. He becomes part of the film's rhythm. And then there's the emotional meaning of the voice. A fragile Dracula needs a voice that can break. A dangerous Dracula needs a voice that can cut. Jones often balances these by keeping his tone low and intimate, then letting intensity appear suddenly in the edges. A sharper consonant, a breath that turns predatory, a small lift in volume that feels like a warning rather than a shout. This creates a feeling that Dracula is always one breath away from losing control. Which is the psychology of ancient grief. Grief does not disappear. It changes shape. It becomes a hair trigger. It becomes a private storm that can erupt without warning. This also connects back to how Besson talks about his filmmaking in interviews. He has described his work less as genre play and more as personal stories about devotion and emotion, and he has emphasized craft and sincerity over cynicism. If the director is aiming for sincerity, the actor has to protect sincerity too. Jones does not wink at the myth. He does not play Dracula as a joke. Even if the film's tone becomes extravagant, the performance tries to stay emotionally straight. And that is why some viewers who do not like the film still cannot forget him. Because the performance feels like it belongs to a different movie sometimes. A quieter movie, a sadder movie, a movie where Dracula is not a villain but a tragedy. That does not excuse the character. It explains the spell. So why does Caleb Landry Jones's Dracula feel fragile and dangerous at the same time? Because he plays Dracula as a man whose grief never ended and whose power became a coping mechanism. Because his physicality collapses inward like mourning, then sharpens into stillness like threat. Because his micro-expressions leak longing and restraint in the same breath. Because his voice carries age not as an accent but as exhaustion, like every word is pulled from a deep place that has been waiting for centuries. And because the director did not cast him to be iconic in the traditional way. Besson cast him because he trusted his strange emotional frequency, a trust that grows out of their earlier work together and the director's public framing of Jones as a central creative partner for this project. This is not a villain performance. It's a possession performance. A Dracula you do not just fear. A Dracula you can almost understand, which might be the most dangerous kind. Thanks for watching. This is Strange Flick Facts, where we explore the characters who stay with us long after the credits roll. Subscribe for more cinematic deep dives.